This is a story for the quiet hours, a gentle journey into the past. Tonight, we'll explore what life was like during one of the most profound and mysterious times in human history, the era of the Black Death. We'll walk softly through the villages and cities of medieval Europe. Before the shadow of the Black Death swept across Europe, life moved with the quiet rhythm of the land. It was the year 1346, and though war, famine, and hardship were no strangers to the people, the world still turned predictably. The seasons arrived in order. The fields bore crops in spring and summer, lay dormant in winter, and were tended by rough, sun-stained hands. Birds chirped from church steeples, marketplaces hummed, children played, and the people, peasants and lords alike, did not yet know that the course of their lives was about to be forever changed. In the countryside, life was slower, yet no less demanding. Villages dotted the green expanse of Europe, each a small collection of wooden homes with thatched roofs and timber frames. These humble dwellings leaned together as if to share warmth against the chill. Smoke rose lazily from their chimneys in the early morning, curling into the grey-blue sky. People awoke before the sun. The rooster's cry was not a nuisance, but a summons. The day's work began with the first light. Men stepped into fields to till soil that had known generations of toil. Women fetched water from the nearest stream or well, carrying it back in heavy wooden pails. Children helped where they could, collecting kindling, feeding livestock, or watching younger. Siblings, their lives were deeply tied to the earth. Wheat, barley, rye, and oats were planted with care and harvested with sickles and sweat. When the season allowed, turnips, beans, and peas were grown in small garden plots. Chickens clucked in pens, pigs rooted through the mud, and cows provided milk when they were not needed for the plough. Meals were simple and filling. A thick porridge of oats or barley, known as pottage, was the daily fare, often flavoured with leeks or onions, and sometimes bits of salted meat. Bread was baked in communal ovens, coarse and dark, made from rye or barley rather than the softer wheat bread of the wealthy. On feast days or during celebrations, the poor might enjoy eggs, honey, or even a slice of roasted meat. Though these were rare treats, they drank ale more than water, not out of indulgence, but necessity. Water sources were often contaminated. Ale, even weak small ale, was boiled in the brewing process, making it safer to drink. In some regions, cider or watered wine was also common, though these too depended on class and geography. Despite the hardships of rural life, there was a quiet order to it. Roles were clearly defined. Men labored in the fields, repaired tools, and worked as blacksmiths or millers. Women managed the home, prepared meals, spun wool, and tended to the sick. Children learned early how to contribute, and their play often mimicked adult work, turning sticks into ploughs, stones into animals, and imagination into rehearsal for a life of labor. Yet this life was not purely hardship. There was community, a closeness born of shared struggles and rituals. On Sundays, villagers gathered in church, where prayers were whispered in Latin, even if most parishioners could not understand the words. Feast days broke the monotony of toil. Harvest festivals and saints' days were marked with music, dancing, and laughter. Neighbors looked after one another, not always out of affection, but out of necessity. In a world without modern medicine or swift justice, survival often depended on the goodwill of those next door. In towns and cities, life moved, faster and with greater complexity. The cobbled streets echoed with the clatter of hooves and the shouts of traders. Markets brimmed with goods, cloth from Flanders, spices from the east, fine ceramics from Italy, and smoked fish from the northern seas. Guilds regulated trades, ensuring quality and protecting their members. Apprentices learned their crafts in the shadows of masters, while journeymen dreamed of becoming their own bosses one day. The air in the cities was thick with the scent of humanity, not always pleasant. Waste was thrown into the streets. Livestock wandered between carts and stalls, and yet within the chaos, life thrived. The wealthy lived in stone homes with glazed windows and hearths. Their tables were spread with roasted goose, rich stews, and fresh fruit brought in from the countryside. Nobles and merchants dined with silver spoons and drank strong wine, while musicians played soft melodies in the background. Education was limited, but not absent. Monasteries preserved books, and some cities boasted schools for the sons of the rich. A few daughters, too, might learn to read if their families allowed it, often with the goal of reading scripture or managing a household. Faith, above all, shaped daily life. The church was not merely a place of worship, it was a source of authority, charity, and social order. Bells rang out to mark the hours. Priests guided not only souls, but local politics. Monks and nuns tended the sick and hungry. Pilgrimages were common, journeys to distant shrines undertaken in the hope of spiritual healing or redemption. To most, life was a test, and heaven the reward. And then, beyond the borders of this world, something stirred in lands far to the east. A sickness had taken root, a fever that burned from within, boils that swelled and burst, a plague that devoured life as quickly as it appeared, carried by fleas, by rats, by trade, and by war. It moved slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. But in 1346, the people of Europe knew none of this. They tilled their fields, sang their songs, and buried their dead, believing the world to be as it always had been, and always would be. They did not yet know that death had already boarded the ships. Through summer, their feet hardened by the ground beneath them. In winter, they huddled close to the hearth, wrapped in whatever warmth could be found. Food, for children, was usually whatever remained after adults had eaten. A crust of bread soaked in broth, a spoonful of beans. On fortunate days, there might be a wedge of cheese, a boiled egg, or, in homes near the woods or rivers, a roasted bird or fish. There was little concept of dessert as we know it. Sweetness came from honey or dried fruits, but even these were rare luxuries. Education was a distant dream for most. A few boys in towns might attend a parish school where a priest taught Latin letters, scripture, and wrote prayers. Girls were often taught at home, if at all, learning to sew, cook, and tend a household. Play was not just recreation, it was preparation. A young girl who played house would one day run one. A boy who herded pretend sheep might soon be trusted with real ones. Children, in many ways, were smaller versions of adults, expected to grow up quickly and assume responsibilities young. And yet, even within this structure, there was space for imagination. Their world was still bright and unspoiled, for now. When the plague began to spread, it came first as a whisper. In the villages, the older children were the first to notice something was wrong. A neighbor's home would go quiet, a friend's. Parent would be gone. There were fewer people in the fields, fewer customers at the market. The games stopped sounding joyful. There was less laughter in the lanes. In towns, it came more quickly. Children who once chased geese down alleys now stayed indoors, eyes wide, ears tuned to the sobs that drifted through the shutters. Parents spoke in low voices, priests moved. From door to door, administering last rites with trembling hands. Children, too, fell ill, often the youngest and weakest first. What began as a fever quickly worsened. Swelling appeared beneath the arms or at the groin. The swellings turned black and burst, spreading the stench of decay even while the child still breathed. Many passed within days, some within hours. There were no explanations, no cures. Parents wrapped their children in blankets and held them, close, whispering prayers, singing lullabies that trembled in their throats. They begged saints and angels for mercy. They tried remedies, herbs, poultices, cold compresses, charms worn around the neck. But none of it worked. The plague did not discriminate. It took the innocent as swiftly as the old dot in monasteries. Where some orphans were sent, the children learned quickly not to ask questions. The monks and nuns were overwhelmed. One day there would be a full hall of young faces. A week later, half the beds would be empty. The survivors did not always understand, but they felt it. The coldness, the loss, the fear that hovered like a cloud. There were stories, two rumors passed from child to child, of entire villages where no one was left, of carts filled with bodies, of death moving like a shadow through the streets. Some children believed the air itself was cursed. They covered their mouths with cloth and clutched little wooden crosses, hoping faith alone would be enough to save them. And some children were left alone altogether, orphaned, wandering from village to village, knocking on doors that did not open. Older siblings became guardians. 8-year-olds learned how to boil water, clean wounds, bury the dead. Childhood ended quickly. Silence replaced songs. Games turned to survival. Still, some held on. There were those who lived, who emerged, pale and thinned, from the storm. Their lives forever altered, but not ended. These children would carry the memories into adulthood. They would remember the stillness, the empty cradles, the broken lullabies. And yet, even among such sorrow, hope clung to the edges of their stories. A girl might find herself adopted by a distant aunt who had lost her own children. A boy might be taken in by a kind-hearted stranger, or join a group of travelers making a new home elsewhere. In the absence of old lives, new bonds were formed, and over time, even laughter returned, quieter, more cautious, but still there. A sign that life, though wounded, continued to reach for the sun. The majority of the population, life before the plague was a cycle of unrelenting labor. Each day was shaped by the soil beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. They lived in small, narrow cottages made of timber and mud, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. There were few windows, and smoke from the hearth often gathered near the low ceilings, stinging the eyes and staining the walls. A single room might house an entire family, along with chickens or goats huddled in corners for warmth. Straw-stuffed mattresses lay on wooden frames or directly on the floor, shared by several children at once. Their lives were governed by the land they worked but did not own. They toiled as serfs bound to the estates of lords and abbeys, required to give a portion of their crops and labor in return for the right to live on the land. Men plowed fields from sunrise to sunset. Women spun wool, baked bread, tended gardens, and raised children, all while contributing to the harvest. Even the youngest were expected to help. A boy of 10 might guide oxen through muddy furrows. A girl not much older might spend the day bent over, pulling weeds or carrying buckets of water. There was no such thing as idleness in the peasant world. If your hands could move, they were expected to work. Their diets were monotonous, yet sustaining. The most common meal was a gruel-like stew called pottage, made from grains and vegetables such as onions, leeks, turnips, and beans. Meat was rare. Chickens and pigs were too valuable alive. When meat did appear, it was often salted or dried. To make it last through the cold months, eggs, milk, and the occasional fish provided other sources of protein. Peasant families relied on communal ovens to bake their bread. Coarse, dark loaves made from rye or barley when times were lean. They might stretch their flour with acorns or chestnuts, or add water to soups until the pot fed twice as many. Clothing was functional and made at home. Wool was spun and woven into thick, scratchy garments. Dyes were expensive, so most clothing was grey or brown, though herbs and roots occasionally added muted colour. A single outfit might last years, mended again and again until the fabric nearly disintegrated. Despite the hardship, there were moments of rest and joy. Holy days offered a reprieve from labour, and church festivals brought music, dancing, and communal feasts. Weddings were modest but merry affairs, with shared ale and laughter. Storytelling passed the long evenings, and even the poorest peasant might have a favourite song or prayer to soothe the spirit after a long day. Then came the plague, at first. They did not understand what was happening. A neighbour would fall ill, then their children, then the whole family. Black swellings rose beneath the arms and between the legs. Fever burned, skin darkened, breathing slowed, and then came stillness. Entire households perished within. Days' crops went unharvested. Cattle wandered loose. There were too few hands to dig graves, and fewer still who dared to try. In many villages, panic overtook routine. Those who could flee did. Some took to the woods, others hid in their homes. A few gathered their loved ones and waited in prayer, hoping that faith would shield them. Priests moved among the dying, administering last rites until they too succumbed. The churchyards filled quickly. In some places, there were not enough coffins or priests or even mourners. Mass graves were dug long, open pits filled with bodies, each layer covered by a thin crust of earth. Peasants who survived the initial wave faced a world both emptier and more uncertain. The manor fields grew wild. Cottages stood abandoned. Roads, once busy with carts and feet, grew quiet, broken only by the tolling of bells or the distant cry of a child. And yet, in that silence, something unexpected began to stir. With so many dead, there was a sudden shortage of workers. Lords and landowners, desperate to harvest their fields, began to offer better terms, higher wages, more freedom. Serfs who had once been tied to the land could now bargain or move to another village that offered more. Some peasants, those lucky enough to survive and healthy enough to work, began to imagine a different life. One not chained to the land or the whims of the manor. A life where they might choose where to live, whom to serve, and how much to ask in return. It was not a revolution, but it was a beginning. Plague. The noble class of medieval Europe lived lives of relative comfort, separated from the hardship of the peasants who worked their lands. They resided in manors and castles, not the fantastical fortresses. of fairy tales, but large stone halls with draughty corridors, towering hearths, and arched windows draped in wool or linen. The nobility lived with a sense of rhythm and ritual. Mornings began with prayers, afternoons brought feasts and falconry, evenings ended with music, storytelling, and, sometimes, the flicker of a visiting minstrel's tune. Their meals were a world apart from the peasant's pottage. Nobles dined on roasted meats, venison, boar, duck, goose. Trays were filled with soft cheeses, fresh fruits, stewed prunes, and almond pastries. Honey sweetened everything from sauces to wine. Dishes were richly spiced with imports from the East, cloves, cinnamon, saffron, purchased at great cost and displayed with pride. Servants attended to every need. Some brushed long braided hair. Others laid out furs or embroidered garments each morning. Their clothes were vibrant reds, deep greens and golds, often lined with silk or trimmed with fur. Rings adorned fingers, brooches fastened cloaks, shoes were pointed, gloves perfumed. Their appearance was both armor and art, yet beneath the elegance, the noble class was not immune to fear. When news of the plague arrived, it came as a rumor whispered into silk-draped halls. A sickness in the south, a town closed, a monastery empty, a merchant who never returned. Some laughed. It oft at first, disease, after all, was the burden of the poor, or so they believed. But then servants began to die. Stewards, falconers, cooks, children, wives, brothers. The plague moved silently through the high stone walls. It cared little for status. The swellings appeared just the same. The fever took even the healthiest. The air in the great halls grew, thick with incense and panic. Many nobles fled. They abandoned their estates for the countryside, or to mountain retreats, or ships moored far from the docks. Some formed traveling courts, constantly on the move to escape the pestilence. In Italy, France, England, the wealthy became nomads, hoping distance alone might keep death at bay. There were physicians, of course educated men, who advised remedies drawn from ancient texts, bloodletting, boiled herbs, precious stones ground into powder, vinegar-soaked rags hung from doorways. None of it worked. Some turned to excess, indulging in feasts and merriment, convinced that joy would drive the plague away. Others cloistered themselves entirely, sealing their families behind locked doors, forbidding any contact with the outside world. These isolated retreats were silent, austere places, filled with whispered prayers and shallow breathing, and yet the plague found them all the same. No inheritance could prevent it. No fortress could stop it. Kings and queens died beside bakers, and monks, bishops fell as swiftly as beggars. The disease offered no explanations, no preference, and no mercy. For those nobles who survived, the world that remained was quieter. Feasts were smaller, parties shorter. Courtly traditions continued, but shadows lingered behind every dance and toast. Heirs were missing. Friends were buried. Entire lineages had vanished, and slowly the great families of Europe began to reckon with the truth. All the gold and silk in the world could not protect them from what had come. Medieval society sat the kings and queens, rulers chosen by birth and believed by many to be divinely appointed. Their word shaped laws, their presence commanded armies, their symbols adorned coins, castles and cathedrals. For centuries, royalty had been the living embodiment of order, and yet, as the plague swept across Europe, not even crowns were safe. Palaces that once bustled with diplomats, clerics, knights, and entertainers fell eerily silent. Courtiers were dismissed. Servants disappeared, either dead or fled. Messages from far-off provinces arrived more rarely, and when they did, they brought nothing but grim numbers and desperate pleas. At first, monarchs did what rulers always did. They issued decrees. Some banned travel between towns. Others ordered the burning of clothes and bedding from the sick. A few called for days of prayer, fasting, and processions through the streets, lines of barefoot penitents whipping their backs in sorrow, hoping to ease the wrath they believed had fallen upon them from heaven. Kings met with councils of physicians and advisors, their courts gathering behind veils and perfumed cloths to discuss the shape of the disease. Reports came from across their realms. Villages emptied overnight, crops rotting in fields, trade routes broken, monasteries closed, and abbeys silent. In some kingdoms, succession became a fragile and uncertain thing. Princes died before kings. Queens passed in childbirth, sickened before midwives could even raise alarm. Entire royal families were reduced to a single surviving heir, sometimes a child or a distant cousin summoned hurriedly from exile. One by one, even monarchs fell. King Alfonso XI of Castile, a ruler of strength and learning, succumbed to the plague in 1350. His death was not on a battlefield, but alone in his tent, taken by a force no army could repel. Other rulers, fearing the same fate, fled from their capitals. Royal retinues moved restlessly across the countryside, trying to outrun the sickness. Grand palaces were abandoned for remote fortresses, and kings issued orders from far-flung estates, surrounded by moats and guards. But the disease was not bound by walls. It slipped through iron gates. It rode on the wind, on the backs of rats, and the breath of servants. Even the most isolated royal courts found themselves staring down death. Some monarchs turned to faith. They funded churches, sent alms to monasteries, or commissioned illuminated manuscripts filled with prayers for deliverance. Others looked for scapegoats, blaming foreigners, beggars, or entire communities in a desperate bid to explain the inexplicable. There were moments of grace to dot. In some places, kings waived taxes to ease the burden of a dying population. Others opened royal granaries, distributing grain to starving towns. A few rulers worked tirelessly to maintain order, to keep trade routes open, to bury the dead, and to speak calmly to a frightened people. But more often, the power of the crown faltered. How does one rule a kingdom half emptied? How does one inspire loyalty when priests lie dead in their robes? When banners hang limp above silent castles, and when bells toll not for glory, but for mourning? In France, England, Germany, and beyond, the image of monarchy was reshaped forever. No longer could a king claim absolute authority without remembering the silence that had once gripped his lands. The plague had reminded all, from the peasant to the prince, that life was fragile and power fleeting, yet still thrones remained. New rulers took the place of the fallen. Children grew into crowns. Courts were rebuilt, though more somber than before, and the memory of what had happened lingered in every hall and chamber, in every ceremony where prayers for the dead became as common as songs of victory. And so, as the Black Death swept through every layer of society, from barefoot children to crowned kings, it left a world transformed, a world quieter, a world more cautious, a world that had seen all too clearly that no wall, no wealth, and no title could hold back the shadow when it came. There was movement, quiet, slow, steady, a ripple in the fabric of the world, far to the east. In the high plateaus and open steppes of Central Asia, something ancient stirred beneath the soil. No one saw it, no one heard it, but deep within the burrows of marmots and rats, a microscopic invader was beginning its silent climb into history. The plague did not begin with a thunderclap. It began with a flea, small, unseen, and hungry. It nestled into the fur of rodents, feeding, waiting. Within its tiny body, a deadly passenger began to multiply, Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that had no name at the time. It had no purpose. It simply was, as the fleas fed, the plague bacteria bloomed. The fleas became infected, and when their rodent hosts died, the insects leaped to new ones, and sometimes to humans. Life in the 1300s was built on movement. Nomadic herders traveled between mountain passes. Silk caravans crossed vast deserts, under the watchful eyes of hired guards. Traders, monks, and pilgrims passed one another in narrow canyons and open markets, exchanging spices, cloth, and stories, and, unknowingly, the disease. The Mongol Empire, vast and connected, stretched across continents like a great stitched quilt. Along its roads and rivers, the plague moved quietly, invisibly, from yurt to village, from traveler to port. It likely reached the Black Sea first. The trading port of Kaffa, on the Crimean Peninsula, was a bustling hub shared by merchants from Venice, Genoa, and beyond. In the year 1346, the Mongols laid siege to the city, but the besiegers began to die quickly, terribly, from a strange new illness that left blackened swellings and fevered minds. According to later accounts, the Mongols, desperate and furious, catapulted the dead bodies of their plague victims over the walls of Kaffa, unintentionally turning the city into one of the first European plague incubators. Panicked Genoese sailors fled by ship, carrying the disease with them across the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1347. The plague arrived in Messina, a Sicilian port. People there began to die within days of the ship's arrival. First it was the dock workers, then the merchants, then their families. The city emptied almost overnight as survivors ran inland, unknowingly spreading the disease further from Messina. The plague fanned out like spilled ink. It followed the shipping lanes to Marseille, Tunis, and Genoa. In the spring of 1348, it reached Venice, a city built on trade and water. Gondolas floated past shuttered homes. The ringing of bells for the dead grew louder day by day. By that summer, the disease had reached Florence, Paris, and London. The roads became veins through which death pulsed. Merchant carts, pilgrim feet, and the wheels of nobility's carriages all carried invisible danger. River barges floated down the Seine and the Thames, bearing not just wine and wool, but plague as well. Some towns were struck so fast they had no time to react. Others heard distant rumors and locked their gates, but the disease found its way inside, through traveling priests, traders, or desperate refugees. The spread was not even nor immediate. In some places, whole communities perished within weeks. In others, the plague came late, or passed over entirely, as though choosing where to strike with cruel intent. By 1349, the Black Death had reached the far north, Scotland, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Even Iceland, remote and windswept, felt the chill of its approach, but the mechanics of its spread remained. elusive to those living through it. People didn't understand bacteria. Germs had no name. Instead, they blamed the stars, the sins of men, the foul air, and even the wrath of God. To those alive at the time, it didn't matter how the plague came, only that it had, and wherever it went, it changed everything. At first it didn't seem real. In distant cities and coastal towns, whispers spread faster than the disease itself. Stories of strange deaths, of entire families lost, of priests who fell ill while offering last rites. But to those still untouched, it felt like a tale meant to frighten children. Something far away, something foreign, and then it arrived. The first signs were subtle. A merchant would not open his shop. A church bell would toll at the wrong hour. A familiar face would vanish from the street, replaced days later by the sound of weeping behind shuttered windows. Then came the symptoms. It began with a fever, hot, sudden, and heavy. The skin grew damp, the pulse quickened, and the eyes lost focus. Within a day, the lymph nodes swelled, especially in the neck, armpits, and groin, into lumps known as buboes. These grew large, dark, and painful. The flesh around them turned black, decaying while the body still lived. In some, the disease took hold of the lungs instead. These victims coughed blood, struggling for breath. Others bled from the nose, the mouth, or beneath the skin bruises, blossoming across their bodies with no injury at all, and then, within days, they were gone. Whole households vanished in less than a week. In some places, the gravediggers could not keep pace. In others, there were no gravediggers left at all. The first reactions were often disbelief. People assumed the sickness was caused by spoiled food, by demons, or by unclean air. In cities, wealthy citizens began to carry pomanders, small metal spheres filled with herbs and perfumes to ward off bad smells, which they believed carried the disease. In the countryside, people turned to prayer. Churches filled with kneeling figures, candles flickering like stars in the dark. Bells rang not in celebration, but in mourning. Priests moved from home to home, offering comfort, communion, and burial rites, until they, too, succumbed, and still. The disease moved forward. In marketplaces, trade began to dry up. Shipments stopped arriving. Goods rotted in their stalls. Cities that had once thrived on commerce grew quiet. Inns closed. Schools emptied. Entire streets became graveyards. In towns where the dead outnumbered the living, early forms of quarantine began. Some cities tried to isolate the sick in hastily, built pest houses, others barred strangers from entering at all. In Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, Croatia, one of the earliest recorded public health measures was introduced in 1377. Newcomers were held outside the city for 30 days before being allowed in. The word for this practice, 40 days. The origin of the term we now call quarantine, but fear doesn't reason. As the plague spread, fear turned neighbors into strangers. Entire families sealed themselves indoors, refusing to speak to anyone, even loved ones. People fled their homes, some into the countryside, others into the wilderness. Those who could afford it retreated to distant estates, hoping the plague would pass them by. Some turned to faith with new fear. Others abandoned it entirely. In places like Germany and France, groups of flagellants, barefoot men dressed in robes, began marching from town to town, beating themselves with whips. In public displays of repentance, they believed that if they suffered, they could appease divine anger. Crowds gathered to watch. Some joined them. Others watched from windows, uncertain dot still. The death toll rose in city after city. The same scenes played out. Carts carrying bodies down cobbled streets. The ringing of bells. The endless digging of graves. In Avignon, where the Pope had taken refuge, so many people died, their bodies were thrown into the Rhine River when burial grounds filled. In London, mass graves were dug in open fields. In Paris, doctors studied the dead in desperation, looking for patterns, for causes, for anything at all. But they found only more death. The theories of the time blamed everything from planetary alignment to poisoned wells. Some claimed it was the result of bad winds, called miasmas, blown in from distant lands. Others said it was punishment for sin, for pride, for gluttony, for being too worldly, too proud. When no cure could be found, some turned to blame. Communities of Jews, already marginalized, were accused of poisoning wells or invoking curses. In many cities, these accusations led to brutal massacres. Another plague, born of fear. This one entirely human. In truth, no one knew what to do. Doctors wore long robes and leather hoods. Some fashioned bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, believing the scent would protect them. These early plague doctors became symbols of the crisis, strange faceless figures walking the edge between science and superstition. For the average person, each day brought new uncertainty. You might wake up healthy and die before sundown. You might bury your child in the morning and find your spouse coughing by evening. A friend might vanish overnight. A town might close its gates forever. Still, life clung on. Even in the worst of it, people found ways to endure. Mothers held their children close. Farmers still rose to tend their fields. In monasteries, monks copied prayers by candlelight, hoping their words would outlast the plague. And as the years passed, the disease slowed. But it did not disappear. The first great wave lasted from 1347 to 1351. It would return again and again, over the centuries, like a shadow slipping across the land. But the first time was the worst, the most sudden, the most terrifying. By the time it ended, millions were gone. But the world remained, changed, broken, grieving, but still standing. As the first wave of the Black Death swept across Europe, a new reality settled over the land. The familiar rhythms of life were broken. Villages that once buzzed with activity fell silent. Streets that had been filled with laughter and song were now empty, save for the tolling of bells and the groans of the sick. Families were torn apart. Children lost their parents. Parents lost their children. No one was spared, not peasants in the fields, nor nobles in their castles. The plague showed no favor. It swept through every layer of society, indiscriminate and relentless. The loss was unimaginable. Some estimates suggest that nearly 1/3 of Europe's population vanished during those terrifying years. Entire communities became ghost towns. Farmlands lay untended, and food grew scarce. Trade slowed to a crawl as fear closed borders. And ports up with so many gone, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces. But grief weighed heavily on every heart. The question lingered in every home, whispered in every prayer. Why? How? What could stop this? Yet even in the darkness, small lights flickered. Neighbors who had once lived as strangers now shared what little they had. Strangers cared for the sick. Priests comforted the dying. Mothers sang lullabies to children orphaned by fate. The world was changed, yes, but it was not defeated. And so, as we look back on those days, let us remember not only the sorrow, but the courage, the resilience, the quiet hope that lived on in the hearts of those who survived. The coming chapters will take you deeper into the lives of those who endured, the children who played amidst the fear, the peasants who labored in the fields, the nobles who watched their world crumble, and the royals who struggled to hold on to power. For now, rest in the gentle memory of a world that faced the storm and, somehow, carried on. When the Black Death swept through towns and villages, it left behind not only empty homes, but questions heavier than the darkest night. What was happening? Why was the world so changed? And most deeply, how could people find peace in such uncertain times? In the absence of understanding, people turned to what they knew best. Faith. Across Europe, churches became beacons in the storm. Their heavy wooden doors opened wide, inviting those who sought solace from the pain and the fear. Inside, the flickering glow of candles lit the faces of the faithful men, women, and children kneeling together in whispered prayer. The church was more than a place of worship. It was the heart of the community. It offered rituals, comfort, and a promise that death was not the end, but a passage to something beyond yet. Even faith was tested. Priests and monks too were vulnerable. Many fell ill while tending the sick, their hands stained with the suffering of their neighbors. Their deaths deepened the shadows, but their courage inspired others. Some saw the plague as a sign, a divine punishment for the sins of humanity. Crowds gathered in repentance, hoping their suffering would turn aside God's wrath. Among them were the flagellants, groups of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with leather thongs, tears mingling with blood. They believed that by embracing pain, they could cleanse the world's sins. Their processions stirred both hope and fear. Some believed they brought healing. Others thought their actions invited more suffering, while many turned inward, seeking to purify their souls. Others searched outward, looking for answers beyond prayer. Doctors, though limited in knowledge, worked tirelessly. Dressed in strange masks with long beaks stuffed with herbs, they visited the sick, trying remedies that ranged from herbal concoctions to bloodletting. In some cities, town councils imposed strict rules, cleaning streets, banning large gatherings, and isolating the ill. Though primitive by modern standards, these efforts showed an early understanding that the disease spread from person to person. Amidst all this, fear found many strange outlets. Blame spread like wildfire. Marginalized groups, especially Jewish communities, were accused of poisoning wells or cursing the land. These accusations led to horrific violence and further tragedy, as innocent people became victims not just of disease, but of hatred. Despite the darkness, flickers of kindness and resilience endured. Neighbors cared for one another. Strangers offered food and shelter. And even as death cast its long shadow, life found ways to continue. As the plague wore on, daily life became a delicate balance between fear and faith. For many, the simplest tasks became acts of courage. In the mornings, peasants rose with the sun, tending their fields with hands raw from toil. They planted and harvested, praying that the earth would still yield food despite the empty villages around them. The work was harder with fewer people, but the land demanded care. Children, though confused by the silence and absence of playmates, found small joys chasing birds in the fields, watching their mothers bake bread, or listening to stories by the fire. Their innocence was a balm in a world overshadowed by loss. In towns, markets reopened cautiously. Stallholders covered their wares, neighbors exchanged goods while avoiding close contact, and the ringing of church bells reminded all of the fragile balance between life and death. The rich, too, faced uncertainty. Nobles withdrew to their estates, ordering feasts to distract from the sorrow. They prayed in grand cathedrals and consulted healers who offered exotic remedies, powdered jewels, rare spices, or mystical incantations. Meanwhile, kings and queens struggled to govern a world in upheaval. They faced empty courts, lost armies, and trembling subjects. Many sought divine guidance, building chapels and commissioning prayers to protect their realms. Throughout Europe, the fabric of society stretched thin, yet, even as fear gripped the hearts of many, faith provided a steady anchor. Families gathered to share stories of saints and miracles. Monks copied sacred texts by candlelight, preserving knowledge for generations to come. In quiet moments, people whispered prayers for healing, for mercy, for peace. The Black Death was more than a disease. It was a test of the human spirit, and through it all, faith and hope endured a quiet light in the darkness. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the world around those who lived through the Black Death changed in ways both subtle and profound. The rhythms of daily life adjusted, not out of choice, but of necessity. Peasants in the fields labored under the weight of loss and uncertainty. Many had lost family members, friends, or neighbors, leaving fewer hands to tend the soil. But the earth did not wait. The seasons pressed on, and crops needed sowing, watering, and harvesting. Those who remained found themselves shouldering heavier burdens, working longer hours, praying for rains and bountiful harvests. The food they grew was simple: barley, wheat, onions, and beans. Staples that could sustain even the most weary meals were humble. Bread was often coarse, made from rye or barley, not the fine wheat favored by the wealthy. Soups and stews, cooked slowly over open fires, combined vegetables with scraps of meat or fish when available. Salted fish, dried legumes, and foraged herbs filled the pantry. For many, a simple bowl of pottage, warm and filling, was a blessing. In villages and towns, neighbors leaned on one another, sharing what little they had. Despite the fear, kindness blossomed quietly. Those who could give, gave, sharing bread, water, or a comforting word. People found strength in small acts of care. Children, though too young to understand the full extent of the plague, felt the change in the air. The laughter that once echoed through lanes grew softer, the games fewer. Yet mothers and elders worked to protect them, wrapping them in warmth and telling stories of heroes and saints to soothe frightened hearts. Markets reopened slowly as fear lessened. Stallholders uncovered baskets of apples, wheels of cheese, and bundles of fresh herbs. The bustle was quieter than before, but life was trying to find its way back. People bartered and traded, mindful of the risk but hopeful for renewal. The wealthy, meanwhile, faced their own challenges. Nobles and merchants ordered grand feasts, not just for pleasure, but as distractions from the shadow that hung over their lives. Banquets featured roasted meats, spiced wines, and delicacies from distant lands. But even these lavish gatherings were tinged with fear of illness, of death, of an uncertain future. Castles and manors were places of refuge and sometimes isolation. Lords and ladies prayed in grand chapels, seeking protection for themselves. and their households, they commissioned prayers and masses, hoping divine favor would keep the plague at bay. Kings and queens, ruling fractured kingdoms, wrestled with decisions that could change the fate of millions. Borders closed, armies shrank, diplomacy slowed. Some rulers turned to religion, building churches and monasteries, believing that spiritual strength was as vital as military might. The church itself was stretched thin. Priests and monks served, both as spiritual guides and caretakers, often at great personal risk. They comforted the dying, heard confessions, and conducted burials, tasks that deepened their faith, but also exposed them to the disease. Across Europe, the shared experience of fear and faith reshaped communities. Many people found themselves questioning long-held beliefs. Others clung more tightly to them. Some sought nuances in mysticism or the teachings of itinerant preachers in villages. Small chapels became centers of hope and healing. Candles flickered in the darkness. Prayers rose like smoke, and music's soft hymns and chants filled the quiet spaces. The Black Death was not only a time of suffering, it was a time of profound spiritual reflection. It revealed both the fragility and resilience of the human heart. Even as the plague continued its relentless course, people sought ways to understand the unseen forces shaping their lives. Without the knowledge of bacteria or viruses, their explanations blended faith, superstition, and the wisdom passed down. Through generations, many believed the plague was sent by God as a punishment for humanity's sins, for greed, pride, and the turning away from divine law. Sermons echoed through cathedrals and village churches, calling for repentance and humility. People fasted and prayed, hoping to appease the heavens. In some towns, processions wound through the streets. Groups of the faithful carried crosses and relics, singing hymns and begging for mercy. These rituals offered not only spiritual solace, but a sense of community in a time of isolation. Yet, alongside hope, fear bred darker responses. Scapegoats were sought, and in their tragic search for blame, innocent lives were lost. Jewish communities, often already marginalized, were accused of poisoning wells or casting spells. These accusations led to expulsions and violent attacks, deepening the sorrow of an already devastated Europe. Others turned inward, seeking protection in strict rules of cleanliness and isolation. Early quarantines were established, and towns closed their gates to travelers. Streets were cleaned, refuse burned, and sick houses marked. Though these efforts were rudimentary, they showed an instinctive understanding of contagion at the heart. Of these efforts were ordinary people struggling to carry on. Women tended to the home and the sick, often acting as nurses, cooks, and comforters. Their labor was unseen but vital. Men who survived worked fields left barren by the loss of laborers, ensuring food supplies endured. Children, sometimes left orphaned, were taken in by neighbors or relatives. Their laughter, though rarer, still brought warmth to chilly days. The wealthy, too, experienced isolation. Though better fed and housed, their lives were shadowed by the knowledge that wealth could not buy immunity. Many withdrew into private chapels, commissioning prayers and lighting candles that flickered like fragile hopes. In the courts of kings and queens, decisions weighed heavily. The plague disrupted diplomacy, trade, and warfare. Some rulers died, and succession crises followed. It was a time when the fate of nations seemed uncertain, balanced on the edge of fear and faith. Throughout this time, stories of miracles and divine intervention spread. tales of saints healing the sick or protecting villagers from the plague comforted many. These stories became part of the collective memory, threads of hope woven into a tapestry of despair. As the first wave of the Black Death began to fade, a cautious optimism took root. Survivors counted their losses, but also their blessings. They vowed to rebuild their communities, tend their fields, and cherish one another. The faith that sustained them became a quiet promise, no matter the darkness. The human spirit endures. In the quiet fear that blanketed the lands during the Black Death, people sought explanations for the suffering that surrounded them. When the causes of such tragedy were unknown and unseen, suspicion often grew like wildfire, seeking something or someone to hold responsible. Across towns and villages, whispers began to circle. Who was to blame for this terrible illness? What force had brought the world to its knees? Without understanding germs or transmission, many turned their gaze toward those already living on the edges of society. Jewish communities, long subject to prejudice and misunderstanding, became tragically vulnerable. Accused falsely of poisoning wells or casting dark spells, they faced violence, expulsions, and death. In towns where Jewish families had lived for generations, homes were destroyed, and people fled or were forced to leave their homes behind. The accusations were baseless, but the fear of the unknown made reason fragile. Fear turned to anger, and anger to cruelty. These dark chapters remind us how easily mistrust can sow division and suffering. Lepers, too, were often blamed. Living separately in leper colonies, their visible differences made them targets of suspicion and isolation. Many were already outcasts, shunned because of their disease, and now faced further fear and misunderstanding. Beggar communities, surviving at the margins, also bore the weight of blame. Their poverty and homelessness made them easy scapegoats. For a society desperate for answers, they were often accused of spreading disease or inviting misfortune. In some places, these fears exploded into violence. Pogroms, organized attacks against Jewish communities, swept through parts of Europe. Innocent people were hunted, imprisoned, or killed. Entire communities vanished, leaving scars that would last centuries. Beyond individuals, suspicion fractured communities. Neighbors looked askance at one another, trust eroded by fear. Doors were bolted and strangers shunned. Even families could be divided by suspicion. Local governments struggled to maintain order, but their power was limited. Sometimes authorities attempted to protect targeted groups, but often they were overwhelmed or complicit. This tragic blaming was a harsh reminder of how fear can cloud judgment, turning neighbors into enemies. It was a painful lesson about the dangers of suspicion and the importance of compassion. Yet, even in these dark times, voices of reason and kindness appeared. Some individuals risked their safety to shelter those in danger, to speak out against injustice, or to offer friendship across divides. These acts, quiet and courageous, remind us of the enduring power of empathy and humanity. The story of blame during the Black Death teaches us not only about history's wounds, but also about the choices we face when fear grips our hearts. In the quiet villages and bustling towns of medieval Europe, the work of healing was as much art as science, a fragile dance between knowledge, faith, and hope. When the Black Death swept across the continent, it overwhelmed the healers of the day, testing the limits of medicine and compassion. Medicine in the 14th century was very different from what we know now. Without microscopes or understanding of germs, doctors relied on ancient texts, observations, and traditions passed down through generations. Their tools were simple, their remedies often based on plants, minerals, and rituals. At the heart of medieval medicine was the belief in balance, the idea that the human body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black, bile, and yellow. Bile health depended on keeping these humors in harmony. When illness struck, it was thought to be caused by an imbalance that needed correction. When the plague arrived, doctors faced a terrifying and unknown enemy. They observed the swollen buboes, painful lumps that appeared under the arms, neck, or groin, and the fever, chills, and weakness that followed. But what caused the illness? How could it be stopped? Many turned to the wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen, ancient physicians whose writings formed the foundation of medicine. Treatments included bloodletting, drawing blood to rebalance the humors, and purging, using herbs and enemas to cleanse the body. While these practices might sound harsh today, they were rooted in the best knowledge available at the time. Apothecaries prepared mixtures of herbs like rosemary, sage, and lavender, hoping their scents and properties could ward off the disease. Others burned aromatic woods or herbs, filling rooms with smoke thought to purify the air. People carried small sachets of these fragrant plants, believing they offered protection. The famous plague doctor masks, with their long beak-like noses, were filled with dried flowers and spices, intended to filter out the miasma, the bad air believed to carry disease. These doctors wore heavy robes and gloves, trying to shield themselves while tending to the sick. Hospitals, often attached to monasteries, became centers of care and refuge. Monks and nuns served tirelessly, providing food, comfort, and prayers. Their compassion was a balm in a time of fear, but resources were limited, and the sheer number of patients overwhelmed even the most dedicated caregivers. Despite their efforts, many healers succumbed to the plague themselves. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the contagion. Others continued their work until the end, embodying courage and sacrifice. Besides medical treatments, folk remedies and superstitions were widespread. People used charms, amulets, and rituals, believing these could protect them from harm. Some drank concoctions made from crushed gemstones or bathed in vinegar. Others avoided certain foods or followed strict dietary rules. Quarantine emerged as a crucial strategy. Cities, like Venice and Dubrovnik, established isolation periods, often 40 days for ships and travelers, before allowing entry. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. These measures slowed the spread of disease in some places and reflected an early understanding of contagion. Even if the precise mechanisms were unknown in homes, families tried to protect their loved ones by separating the sick, cleaning living spaces, and burning contaminated belongings. Fear made people wary of touching one another, but also spurred acts of care and devotion. That medicine was limited, the desire to heal and comfort was strong. Every remedy tried, every prayer whispered, was an expression of hope, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to surrender. The struggle against the plague would teach Europe many lessons. It pushed the boundaries of medicine, led to improvements in public health, and changed how people viewed disease and care. And through it all, the healers, whether learned physicians, humble apothecaries, or devoted monks, remained pillars of strength, shining light into one of history's darkest moments. Asterisk, the devastation of the Black Death also sparked new ways of thinking about health and disease. The limitations of medieval medicine became clear, and scholars began questioning old beliefs. Some doctors recorded detailed observations of symptoms and spread, slowly laying the groundwork for future medical science. One such change was the growing importance of hospitals and public health measures. While hospitals before had mainly cared for the poor and pilgrims, during the plague they became crucial centers for isolating the sick and trying to contain the disease. Cities started to regulate cleanliness more strictly. Streets were cleaned, waste removed, and regulations passed to manage the disposal of bodies. These were small but important steps towards modern public health. Meanwhile, some of the folk remedies that people clung to reflected deep human needs, the need for comfort, control, and community. Rituals, prayers, and herbal medicines may not have cured the plague, but they offered emotional healing, a way to face the unknown with courage. The role of the clergy intertwined with medicine. Priests and monks not only offered spiritual care, but often acted as caregivers. They administered last rites, comforted the dying, and helped families grieve. This spiritual healing was deeply valued, providing peace when physical healing was out of reach. Amidst the fear, stories of kindness and bravery emerged. Some healers risked their lives to tend to the sick, while families cared for each other with devotion and tenderness. These acts, though often small and private, were powerful expressions of humanity. Over time, the experience of the Black Death led to a slow but lasting shift in how Europeans understood illness and care. The plague exposed the need for better knowledge, cleaner environments, and more organized health systems. Doctors began to place greater emphasis on observation and documentation. Universities that taught medicine started to incorporate new ideas, setting the stage for the medical advances of later centuries. Though the Black Death was a tragedy beyond measure, it also marked a turning point, a moment when humanity began to wrestle more deeply with the mysteries of disease, healing, and survival. And so, in quiet villages and grand cities alike, the struggle to heal continued. Each remedy tried, each life saved, was a step forward on a long journey toward understanding and hope. When the Black Death finally began to recede, the world it left behind was forever altered. Survivors faced a reality filled with loss, uncertainty, and the challenge of rebuilding lives and communities. Yet amid the grief, new opportunities arose. The very fabric of medieval society began to shift, driven by the forces of survival and change. For those who lived through the plague, everyday life was transformed. Entire villages were sometimes wiped out, leaving empty fields and silent homes. Others watched as family members, friends, and neighbors disappeared, one by one. This loss was deeply personal, but it also shaped the collective experience of communities across Europe in the aftermath. The balance of labor and land was profoundly affected. With so many lives lost, there were fewer hands to work the fields. For the peasants and laborers who remained, this shortage meant something unusual: increased bargaining power. For generations, peasants had to accept strict conditions set by landlords and nobles. But now, with their labor in high demand, many were able to negotiate better wages, improved living conditions, or even freedom from servitude. This shift sparked tension, as those in power struggled to maintain control over a changing workforce. Governments responded by passing laws to limit wages and restrict the movement of workers, trying to restore the old order. But these efforts often failed in the face of economic realities. peasants began to leave their villages in search of better opportunities, sometimes moving to towns or other regions. This migration helped fuel the growth of towns and cities. Urban centers slowly revived, becoming hubs of commerce, craft, and culture. Markets reopened, and guilds, organizations of skilled workers, grew in importance. The plague's devastation was harsh, but the rebirth of urban life marked a new chapter. Survivors had to adapt not only economically but emotionally. The trauma of loss and fear lingered, and many turned to new spiritual practices, art, and literature to make sense of their experiences. The macabre imagery of death and decay appeared in paintings and writings, reminding future generations of the fragility of life. Families and communities rebuilt, drawing strength from traditions and new ideas. Marriage, birth, and celebrations continued honoring life's persistence even in the shadow of death. The environment, too, was changed by the plague. With fewer people cultivating the land, forests expanded, and wildlife returned to areas once cleared for farming. This quiet renewal was a subtle but powerful sign of nature's resilience as the years passed. The Black Death returned in smaller outbreaks, but society was better prepared. Public health measures, quarantine practices, and medical knowledge had advanced. Communities learned to live with the presence of disease, balancing caution with the need to continue. Education saw changes as well. Universities gradually reopened, welcoming new students and ideas. Scholars studied ancient texts alongside fresh observations, planting seeds for the Renaissance and scientific revolution to come. Despite the hardships, hope endured. The story of survival after the Black Death is one of resilience, a testament to human strength and the capacity for renewal. In the years following the plague, society's transformations continued to unfold, touching every part of daily life. One of the most profound shifts was in the relationships between different social classes. With the labor shortage, peasants found themselves in a stronger position, and some even acquired small plots of land. This newfound independence challenged the traditional feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries. While nobles resisted these changes, history was moving forward. For many, this was a time of both hope and uncertainty. People dreamed of a future where hard work might bring greater rewards, but the wounds of loss were never far from mind. Families worked to rebuild their homes, tending fields once more, planting seeds for new beginnings. In the city's guilds flourished. These groups protected the interests of skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, weavers, shoemakers, and regulated training and quality. The revival of trade and craft helped revive economies, fostering innovation and cultural growth. The Black Death also left a lasting mark on medicine and public health. Communities understood the importance of cleanliness and isolation. Some towns created early versions of public health boards, setting regulations to manage waste and prevent the spread of disease. Quarantine practices became more formalized. Ports established dedicated quarantine stations, or lazars, where ships and travelers were held before entering cities. These efforts slowed future outbreaks and showed a growing understanding of contagion, even without knowing germs. On a more personal level, survivors' experiences shaped their worldview. The proximity to death made people cherish life's small moments, the laughter of children, the warmth of a hearth, the comfort of a friend's embrace. Art and literature reflected this shift. The dance of death motif, showing figures from all walks of life, led by death itself, became a common theme. It reminded people that mortality was universal, regardless of status or wealth. Religious life also adapted. While the church had been a source of comfort, the scale of the crisis raised questions and doubts. Some turned to mysticism or alternative spiritual movements. Others renewed their faith with fervor, seeking meaning and hope. Education expanded as well. The universities that survived began to foster new ideas and scientific inquiry. Scholars, like Ibn al-Khatib and later Renaissance thinkers, built on the experiences of the plague, helping humanity move toward a deeper understanding of disease. Economically, the plague accelerated changes that had been brewing. The decline of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, and the growth of market economies transformed Europe's social fabric. Though painful, these changes paved the way for the modern world. Even as the Black Death faded into history, its echoes remained. It taught lessons about the fragility of life, the dangers of fear and suspicion, and the power of compassion and resilience. In quiet moments, looking back, we see how survival amid such immense tragedy reshaped society, and how the human spirit, though tested, endured. The Black Death was more than a moment of suffering and loss. It was a turning point in the story of humanity. Its legacy stretches far beyond the years it ravaged the continents, echoing through the centuries in ways both subtle and profound. After the last great waves of the plague passed, Europe was forever changed. The population, reduced by as much as half in some areas, slowly began to recover. But society would never return to the world it had been before. One of the most lasting effects was the transformation of the social order. The devastation created a new balance between labor and landowners, reshaping feudal relationships. With fewer workers available, peasants and laborers found themselves with newfound freedoms and bargaining power. Serfdom, which had bound many to the land and to the will of their lords, began to decline. In some places, peasants purchased their freedom outright, while others negotiated better conditions. This gradual loosening of the old system paved the way for a more modern concept of labor and personal rights. The economy, too, shifted dramatically. The scarcity of workers led to higher wages and increased demand for skilled craftsmen. Towns and cities grew as centers of trade and innovation, fueling the rise of a merchant class that would become influential in the centuries ahead. Agriculture changed as well. With fewer mouths to feed, landowners converted marginal farmland to pasture for sheep, spurring the wool trade and the growth of textile industries. These economic changes helped spark the beginnings of capitalism in Europe. The plague also left its mark on culture and the arts. In the face of death's shadow, people turned to new forms of expression to understand their place in the world. Literature, painting, and sculpture reflected themes of mortality, suffering, and hope. The motif of the danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a powerful reminder that death is the great equalizer. Kings and peasants alike were shown, walking hand in hand with death, emphasizing life's fragility and the importance of compassion. In medicine, the Black Death sparked a slow but important transformation. The overwhelming failure of traditional remedies led scholars to seek new knowledge, emphasizing observation and empirical study. This intellectual curiosity planted seeds for the Renaissance, an era of renewed interest in science, art, and human potential. Universities expanded their curriculum, and medical texts began to incorporate new findings. Public health practices also improved. Cities recognized the importance of sanitation and quarantine, lessons learned from the plague's devastation. These early measures laid foundations for modern epidemiology and disease prevention. Religious life was deeply affected. The enormous scale of death challenged faith and doctrine, leading some to question the Church's role and authority. Yet for many, religion remained a source of comfort and community in uncertain times. Mystical movements and new religious sects arose, offering alternative spiritual paths. At the same time, the Church sought reform and renewal, eventually leading to profound changes in European Christianity. The Black Death's legacy is complex, a tapestry woven from loss and resilience, fear and hope, destruction and renewal. It reminds us that even in our darkest hours, humanity finds ways to adapt and survive. The lessons of the plague continue to resonate today, shaping how we respond to disease, social upheaval, and the fragile balance of life. The story of the Black Death also carries important lessons about human nature and society. In times of crisis, fear and suspicion can rise quickly. The plague brought scapegoating and violence against minorities, especially Jewish communities, lepers and beggars, revealing the dangers of mistrust and prejudice. Yet, amid this darkness, there were countless acts of kindness, courage, and solidarity. Families cared for one another, communities supported the vulnerable, and healers risked their lives to comfort the sick. This resilience reminds us of the strength found in empathy and unity. It teaches us that healing comes not only from medicine, but from compassion and shared humanity. The Black Death also highlighted the importance of science and learning. The struggle to understand and combat the plague motivated new ways of thinking, setting the stage for future discoveries. In our modern world, we still face challenges from disease and uncertainty, but the legacy of the Black Death guides us, reminding us to listen to knowledge, care for one another, and prepare wisely. As we look back across the centuries, we see a story of survival and transformation. The people of the medieval world faced unimaginable hardship, yet their experiences shaped the course of history. Their journey from despair to hope, from death to renewal, continues to inspire. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and a gentle reminder that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. As we come to the close of this journey through the times of the Black Death, it is natural to pause and reflect on what we have learned. The story of the plague is not just one of loss and despair, but also of resilience, transformation, and hope. We have seen how the lives of children, peasants, nobles, and kings alike were touched by this vast and terrible illness. Each life changed, each family affected in ways both visible and unseen. The Black Death challenged everything people thought they knew about the world, about health, about society, and about the delicate balance of life itself. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming hardship, humanity endured. People adapted, communities rebuilt, and new ideas took root. The seeds of change sown during this time grew into many of the foundations of our modern world, from advances in medicine and public health to shifts in social structure and culture. Most importantly, this history reminds us of the power of compassion and courage. It shows us that even in the darkest times, kindness can light the way, and that together we can face the unknown. As you close your eyes tonight, may you carry with you the quiet strength of those who lived through the plague, their courage, their hope, and their enduring spirit. May their story be a gentle reminder that no matter how difficult the night, the dawn will come. Thank you for listening.